Okay, this is the last of the mini lectures following spring break, and in this one I'm going to talk a bit about the demographic transition. It's going to be a little bit longer than the others, but we're going to cover some key ideas to kind of bring population all the way together here. So let's get started. First of all, make sure that you understand that when we talk about the demographic transition, it is a model because what we've done here is we've taken some historical data for certain countries, kind of put it as a prediction to where other countries would go in terms of population dynamics, given certain characteristics of their economy as well as technology. So remember that model. Next, we're going to talk about what it tries to explain. We're going to talk about the three lines, the four stages, and then a question of the fifth stage. So again, remember, it is a model. The purpose of the model is to explain changes in population growth. So again, we're interested in how the population changes over time. It really uses two very, very simple factors. Remember, crude birth rate and crude death rate. So three lines, population, crude birth rate, and crude death rate. It relates those changes, at least it argues that changes in population and changes in birth rates and death rates are resulting in changes in the economies of populations, regional migrations, and changes in health technology. Okay, so let's look at it. First of all, we have a line of crude birth rate. And so what the model did, when the model was developed, what they essentially did is took some of the oldest data we had on births and deaths, and they began to examine it. So here, for example, two of the countries that were kind of used in its development, the United Kingdom and Sweden. And what they saw was in terms of birth rates were very, very high through about 1880 in both these countries, and then they began to come down. And then starting at about, if you'll notice here, they began to level off in the 1970s. And so we have this kind of transition. We go from very high and very erratic to relatively stable. And so the question is why? Well, we can also tie that to death rates. And here again, we'll just look at England and Wales. And if we take England and Wales, we see that in fact the same kind of trend happens. In other words, very, very high and very erratic death rates. And then that death rate begins to decline and begins to stabilize at a lower rate in the 20th century. So birth rates and death rates. Then we take total population, and we see that, and again, this graph is kind of flattened for Sweden because of its relatively small starting population. But if we look at the United Kingdom's numbers, in other words, we have relatively flat, and then it begins to take off. And if we looked very closely at the last 15 years to 20 years, we'd see that it's kind of beginning to flatten out. And so we see that these three numbers, these three lines, in a sense, can be put together, and we begin to see a general trend. So if we look at these again, so here's Sweden's, and again we have our birth rate and our death rate, okay? And what we see is that these two lines begin to decline, but the death rates appear to decline first. And so again, we can see the same thing in Germany. Now, the other thing that the model asks, and again, this is these three lines, birth rates, death rates, total population, and for countries that we have a lot of data for, they seem to follow a pattern. What you'll notice too, though, is if we look at Chile, for example, notice that it's beginning to have that separation later. The same thing in Mauritius and then in China. So what was originally argued was that we should see the same demographic transition occur in different countries over time as they become, quote unquote, more developed. Now, this is a bit problematic, but it is how the model was structured. So we put all those countries together and we kind of get this idea. A four-stage model that's, in a sense, already happened for most of Western Europe and for North America that has four stages that we know have existed: the pre-modern stage, the urbanizing industrial stage, the mature industrial stage, and then the post-industrial stage. And in them, we have very specific characteristics. Okay, so here we go. And now we're gonna talk about the fifth stage in just a minute. But again, we have the pre-industrial stage. So again, let's go back, the pre-modern or pre-industrial stage, and in that we have very high birth rates and very high death rates. In this case, we have, because both of those are very, very high, our population remains relatively stable. Birth rates are high because, at least the argument goes, because death rates are high. If you have extremely high levels of infant mortality, populations culturally are going to have large numbers of children in order to ensure some survival. The other thing that goes on in a pre-industrial or pre-modern stage is that children are actually labor and they are helpful in an agricultural setting. Now we go into stage two. And remember that stage two, we're talking about this urbanizing and industrializing. And I want you to focus on those two terms. Urbanizing, one thing that happens during this stage is that populations tend to move towards urban areas. So there's a decreasing population in agriculture. What that also means then, though, is that children are no longer labor, they're simply parts of the family. The other thing, though, that happens is during this stage, this industrialization, technologies begin to develop that increase food security and increase the ability of populations to transport food. So we have less famine, we have less food instability, and we have urbanization where children are not as much at risk. And so again, in these urban areas, urbanization, industrialization, we begin to see death rates drop. But birth rates don't drop. And the reason for that is, at least for one or two generations, because your parents saw children die. In other words, let's say your mother or father were part of a family of 8 and 6 of their siblings died. Well, they're going to still think that's what's going to happen. And so they have 6 or 8 children. Now, in that scenario, let's say that only one dies. Well, then the next generation might have a slightly smaller, or they might have the same. But it takes a couple generations of children all surviving for that to kind of sink into the culture. Now, in stage three, what we would call that, again, this idea of the mature industrial stage, it is very clear that children are going to survive. Technologies of health have become widespread. That is, sanitation, sewer system, clean water, basic medical understandings have come into being. As a result, pretty much children live. Your infant mortality rate really falls through the floor. And therefore, families have begun to have fewer and fewer children. Now, the other thing, though, that happens in this stage is that death rates have kind of stabilized. They've gotten to a point where technology, health, infrastructure have all pretty much gotten death rates to kind of a standard level. And there's very little that we can do to reduce those death rates. And so during this stage, though, what we see is a beginning of the slowing of the population growth. Remember, in this stage, stage two, when birth rates were very high and death rates were dropping, our population grows, and it grows rather dramatically. At the end of stage three, we begin to see our population begin to level off. And that happens as birth rates continue to drop towards the level of death rates, and we kind of get a stabilizing population. And in this case, generally speaking, we call stage four a post-industrial, and that is where affluence increases and the desire to have fewer children kind of reaches its apex. Now, the big question, what happens in stage five? Well, there's really two models for it. One is what we call the selfish model, and that means that as affluence increases, people want fewer and fewer children to concentrate their wealth. And so in that case, we might have populations that decline. Alternatively, we may have a population that actually, there's some evidence that some populations, as they become more affluent, start to have a slight increase in population as people feel comfortable being able to afford 2 to 3 children. And so again, it's rather dynamic in that question. Now, ultimately, what we have to ask about the demographic transition as a model is whether it works everywhere. What are the factors that may not make it work in certain cultures? And what we can look at here is that we may see things such as family planning. Examples of this include prohibitions on contraception. We may also see societies that are strongly paternal, that is, that the male child is extremely important, and so increases the number simply by statistics. All of these are parts of the question of demographic transition, but remember that the demographic transition relates economies and technology to population change. Okay, that's it for this lecture. We'll see you next week.